Hello, welcome back to our discussion on the Scopes trial. You've come to the conclusion, our little bonus episode, which is going to be our debate slash discussion on the Scopes trial. The way this is going to work, very simple. I'll let Brad explain in a moment. We're all going to have a little bit to say about this and a little bit to discuss. So, Brad, why don't you explain our format and then we'll jump into it.
Absolutely. So we're going to have a bit of like Jordan said, a roundtable debate where we're each going to give one hot take. For each person's hot take, they'll have 3 minutes to defend their hot take, after which each of the other two will have a 2 minute period to state whether they agree or disagree with the hot take and to give their reasoning why. Once each of the other two people have given their perspective, the first person will have a second opportunity to clarify their position or just to respond to what the other two have said. Once that's finished, move to the next person, and they'll give their hot take. Once all three of us have gotten a chance, that'll be it, and our debate will be done. So, without any further ado, Jace, what is your hot take with respect to the lasting effects of the Scopes trial?
All right, my hot take is the fact that I think Brian did more damage to Christianity than Darrow could have ever hoped to do. And here's why. Brian comes in and he portrays Christianity as anti-evolution. He paints this whole thing as you either believe in God or you believe in evolution. You either believe in science or you believe in evolution. You can't have both. He is the reason that we have the dichotomy. Yeah, Darrow capitalized on it, but it's because Brian came to the debate first. He's the one that wanted the law to be there. He's the one that came into the trial in order to be the prosecutor, and that's what brought Darrow in the first place. If Brian hadn't stepped in and done what he did, then we wouldn't have had the problem of the Scopes trial that we had now. His stance isn't nuanced, it's simply ignorant. He allowed the national media like Mencken to portray Christians as ignorant and backwards, and he was able to frame science as the enlightened point of view, and honestly, he made most moderate and liberal Christians feel embarrassed and they silenced themselves and retreated from the public square. We see it today in groups like Answers in Genesis or the Institution for Creation Research that are continuing Brian's legacy by insisting on a rigid, literal interpretation of the Bible, and they explicitly reject theistic evolution, the one, I'll call it like middle ground, where you can actually have a conversation on the matter, because they're saying that it's compromising the gospel rather than actually looking at the data and the evidence. And if you look at like the Creation Museum and Ark Encounter, you draw all these visitors and people, but honestly, if you look at their evidence, half the time their like artifacts are upside down because they don't even know how to read the Hebrew letters that they're showing. If you look at the Pew Research Center, you're seeing that young people are leaving Christianity in droves. And I think it's like 30% of young people who leave the church cite the differences between science and religion as their number one reason. It's driving people away from the church. And the fact is, it's not even a real reason. It's a reason of perception, and that perception goes back to Brian and Brian's views and what he represented. And so if Brian hadn't taken such a strong stance and insisted on showing up at this trial and making a fool out of himself, then honestly, I don't think that we would have the problem of the debate between science and religion that we have today. Instead, I think that we would be at a much more enlightened spot within society where religion and science were working together to show us all truth rather than saying that you can only look at scientific truth or you can only look at theistic truth. Both are true. We need both of these things, but there's a divide because of the damage that Brian did.
All right, thank you very much, Jace. Jordan, do you agree or disagree with Jace's hot take?
I'm
By the
going
way, for
to.
those, I'm sorry, I was cackling during that because Jordan has been the world's biggest defender of Ryan while we've been discussing this. Not in the sense that he thinks everything he's done is perfect, but in the sense that he felt he was given an unfair shake of things by the media. And so hearing Jace give his hot take, because we didn't talk about what these would be in advance, Jace just opens with, Brian did more damage to Christianity than Darrow ever could. I can't wait to hear Jordan's
Hey, you
response.
said you wanted me to
So-
make it sound spicy, and so
yeah,
there it is.
that's what the hot is in hot take. So Jordan, please tell me, do you agree with Jace?
I fundamentally disagree. Quite heartily disagree. I think the biggest misconception there is based on the idea that Brian is the one that promoted all of this ideology about this strict dichotomy, and I think quite the opposite if you look at what he said, and if you look at the transcripts and even a lot of his elements in the trial, he spoke quite against that. I think he actually promoted a very nuanced position and promoted the open discussion of all things. But I don't think his opposition to evolution was from a scientific perspective, but I think he had an opposition to the moral underpinnings of those who promoted it. And I think that was very evident. So I don't think it's fair to list him as the reason that all of this came out. You know, the defense had a narrative from the get-go that the media was already going to push. It had nothing to do with what Brian was going to do. And so, yes, Brian happened to be the one with the target on his back, but it was going to happen to whoever walked into that courtroom, and it didn't matter who walked in, the narrative was going to be exactly the same. And I think he handled things as well as anybody could. Brad, what about you?
Thanks, Jordan. So my actual position that I'd like to give would be some nuanced view between agree and disagree, but that's not what we're here for in this section. So for that reason, I agree, James. Sorry,
Oh, man.
I agree, and the reason I agree is the world's greatest blunder. Everyone knows the world's greatest blunder is to go into a land war. In Asia, is that it?
Yeah. Never go into a land
And
war in
only
Asia.
second is this, to go up against a Sicilian when death is on the line. But third, and nearly as great a blunder as those two, is to hold yourself out on a national stage as an expert in subject matter that you are not an expert in. And I know you think I'm talking about science. I'm not talking about science. We have correctly pointed out that Brian backed down from time to time on the scientific questions. What I'm talking about is theology. Brian was not, at any point in his life, a theologian. And as fun as it is for yahoos like us to go and create a YouTube channel called Verse versus Verse and talk about theology when only one of us has a degree in this stuff, congratulations, Jordan, to hold yourself out on a national stage that is shaping the face of Christianity, frankly, worldwide, when you're not even a theologian in any sense of the term, is incredibly damaging. And I think there were plenty of points during this where he was forced, because he took the stand, to discuss issues of theology that he was not equipped to discuss. And on top of that, as much as he tried to remain nuanced, I think there are points at which you can see his fundamentalist background, his sort of pop culture, pop Christianity of the time leaking through what he's saying in ways that did not represent a full nuanced view of the Bible as well as they could have.
Yeah. And I think that right there is kind of how I come to my conclusion. And Jordan, you're right. It's not that Brian came in trying to make this dichotomy, right? Like, he wasn't opposed to all science. He wasn't even strictly opposed to the teaching of evolution, simply to teaching it as fact rather than theory. But he did, implicitly at least, promote this false dichotomy between human evolution and Christian belief. He drew this boundary of, like, acceptable science around what his views allowed him to believe, and his interpretations of Scripture. He didn't actually follow just where the evidence led. And now let me be clear, when I'm saying evidence, I'm not just talking about scientific evidence. I'm saying that science and the Bible can both be used as evidence to talk about the same thing, especially with something like human origins, whenever there is a real, like, metaphysical aspect to that, right? But I don't think that he was carefully considering that dichotomy, and I think it's because, like Brad said, he's not a theologian, and he wasn't trained to do that. And so while Darrow might have exploited that divide and that shortcoming, Brian reinforced it in the public mind by taking the stage and trying to tie the gospel to a literal view of Adam and Eve. And I think that the effect was that Orthodox Christianity was equated with anti-evolutionism and therefore anti-science and anti-intellectualism, and I think that's still hindering fruitful dialogue today, and it's driving people away from the church, because there are groups of Christians who very much do fall into the anti-science view. And I think a lot of that can be traced back to Brian, not necessarily that he caused it all, but in the sense that I think he really epitomized it and reinforced it. So with that, Jordan, are we doing Jordan next?
You decided.
All right,
we are.
Jordan, what is your hot take from the trial?
My hot take is that the subsequent divorce between secular society, i.e. science, i.e. naturalism, and the religious organizations and religious culture has led to a complete fundamental breakdown of science, and it has led science to be completely unscientific, fundamentally unreliable, and fundamentally flawed from the get-go. The entire philosophy of science cannot be removed from a completely secular, anti-God, anti-theist mindset. And even to say that methodological naturalism can be separated from philosophical naturalism is completely erroneous, because there's absolutely no way that you can look at something methodologically with a fundamental belief that all things must be natural and say that there is not a philosophical underpinning that all things must be natural. The secular world has completely taken over the scientific community, and it has left science incomplete. It has left science untrue, and it has left this completely unscientific view of what science really is, and it's disallowed anyone from actually having a reasonable discourse on scientific in a scientific context that is whole and complete. Like I mentioned earlier, you take theology and you take philosophy out of science, and you've basically just completely destroyed science. And I think that because of this separation that's removed religion from the conversation entirely, whether that be in the public education sphere, whether that be in the media, whether that be just social circles, and to create this fundamental line in the sand that doesn't allow even people who believe in God to discuss it in the context of the natural world, has completely eroded the whole purpose of science. And those in science now cannot understand and cannot see how deeply that bias runs and how much it has affected and limited their ability to perform science. That was
Brad, I'm
very
gonna let you
short.
take
I'm
this one
surprised I
first.
only went for like a minute and a half. That's pretty good.
Congratulations on that. Well, I guess I went second last time, so I'll go first on this one. I am going to say that, Jordan, I disagree.
I knew
And the reason that I disagree with that is because, for one, as an attorney, it is part of my job to methodologically take on a position that I philosophically do not hold. I do this almost every single day. For example, if I'm arguing a patent at the patent office and I'm trying to say, this actually is novel and non-obvious because XYZ, I may or may not actually believe that. I'm just trying to give my client the best argument I can, and I have to fundamentally believe that I can be effective in using a method that I don't philosophically believe in. And so I think that system works. And to apply that to science, what I'm saying is there are plenty of scientists who are fully capable of applying methodological naturalism without endorsing philosophical naturalism. Or, even if they endorse philosophical naturalism, to being able to apply methodological naturalism in such a way that it is scientifically effective without having their philosophical underpinnings flow into that. Because, for one, in the vast majority of situations, when we're talking about scientific data, whether or not I philosophically believe that God is the creator of all things and that God is the uncaused first cause that led to whatever scientific truth we're talking about, let's say some novel potential cure for diabetes, right? Whether or not I think God is involved or not is unlikely to change my final conclusions on that subject. And so for that reason, I think that science as a structure works and will continue to work through methodological naturalism, regardless of whether the practitioner of science has a view on philosophical naturalism.
Honestly, I struggle to know whether I agree or disagree because I feel like there's kind of two aspects to what you're saying. I'm gonna cheat and I'm gonna give agree and disagree on different points. I agree in the sense that secularism has taken over science and has caused science, or at least those interpreting the data, to view the fact that there are certain things that we can understand with science. Like, science is designed to test the natural world and to understand the natural world, but that shouldn't lead to the conclusion that the natural world is all that there is, but often that is what the conclusion becomes. So I would agree that secularism has poisoned science in the sense that it's inflated science and the thinking of science to begin to believe that whatever you understand from science is absolute and total truth, not just a truth or part of truth. But at the same time, I disagree in the same way that Brad does in this, because I don't think that there's damage done to science in of itself as long as it's used within the proper context, even under an atheistic model. Like, for example, if we look at data that we have from physics, like discoveries of gravity, I don't think that the consideration of whether or not God exists plays into F equals G m1 m2 over r squared. I don't think that the fact that Gregor Mendel was a monk really had a lot to do with whether or not Mendelian genetics works. Science is attempting to provide a framework of and an explanatory power of how things work, not necessarily why they work or why they exist. That's theology. Now, when science tries to overreach those bounds and tries to say, we know how it works, therefore this exists because of science, that's absolutely a mistake. And that's a painful mistake, and I don't know why anyone would make it, because it feels so obvious whenever you try and talk about it that way. But just because somebody is an atheist doesn't mean they can't come to a good scientific conclusion. But I will end with something that supports your view, and it's a quote from C.S. Lewis. He said, "Men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver." In that sense, absolutely, you can't really divorce science from religion, because without the understanding of nature being inherently ordered and coming from an ultimately ordered system and a lawgiver, there would have been very little reason to look for these aspects of science in the first place. So, could we do without God in science now? I mean, we could still come to conclusions, but would those conclusions ultimately have meaning? I'd say no.
Okay.
Well, I just want
I,
to say that, Jace, you cheated by being nuanced in the roundtable debate section,
Right.
but I will forgive you
Apologies.
this time.
well, let me I guess give my concluding statement since Jace gave one. But I guess to a large extent I see where you guys are coming from with the disagreement that science still holds, and I agree science still holds. But I guess my point is that because of the limitation that people have put on it, that it must remove an element of the why of what we do. It has. I think it limits the how, and I think that to a large extent. I mean, if you really look back at everything, we talked about how the theology and the speak of God in the classroom has been completely removed. Think about it. I mean, do you really have a context when you were growing up? Did you really have a context of how God fit into a scientific model, right? You don't, and it's not taught, and then that moves straight into higher education, and at no point in time is that really ever entered into the equation at all. And I think that if we're really being honest with ourselves, if we're not really having a full conversation about it, are we really being truly scientific? I mean, if we're removing an element, yes, you could say maybe that element is irrelevant. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But if we're not willing to have the conversation, is that really a truly scientific understanding of things? Is that really a truly scientific conversation? And to your point, yeah, I was being a bit extreme when I'm talking about like it's not really science, but it really is incomplete. I think we can all agree it's incomplete if we don't include conversations about theology, even if we're saying, well, they don't really affect that. Well, how do we know that unless we have the conversation? And so I guess my point is, we can't really effectively say that we are teaching real science if we're not really having the whole conversation. Okay, well, I guess that just leaves one other person for a hot take. Brad, what is your hot take?
So to explain my hot take, I first have to explain some of the historical context we've walked through so far. So we have seen recently, perspectives on science and perspectives on religion begin to converge, in which it is very common to have a Christian in the United States, and I'm speaking about the United States specifically here, who holds the view that God is real, God created the heavens and the earth, and yet evolution is a correct theory, right? And so I think we're going to see a continuation of that line of reasoning that moves past this sort of just social and informal belief to a downright creedal nature that goes so far as to influence the formal theology of existing Protestant denominations within the United States. And what I mean by that is right now, there are existing denominations, plenty of them, where if you don't believe in a 7-day creation, you're going to have an issue with the denomination, whether that means you can't be a pastor, or maybe you can't be an elder, or a deacon, or a bishop, or whatever the role may be. I think we're going to see that flipped on its head in many denominations in the United States, where within the next 100 years, we're going to have churches in the mainline Protestant denominations, so a lot of the more theologically liberal denominations, where it is in their creedal statement that theistic evolution took place, and that is their model by which God created humanity over time. And I think that even in the less theological liberal denominations, so now we're talking about our Baptists and Pentecostals and Church of Christ and non-denominational or Diet Baptist Christians, I think that we're going to see splintering, like we've seen in the mainline denominations, where one side thinks that theistic evolution is theologically required to be a good Christian, and the other side feels the other way. And we're going to continue to see the side that is more fundamentalist, or at least more conservative, get pushed to the fringes of society over time, whether or not that's a good thing.
I mean, that doesn't sound like a hot take. That just sounds like observation of society and the way our culture is.
Creedalization of syncretism between science and religion isn't a hot take. I feel like me calling it creedal is hot.
I guess I'll give my verdict. I disagree. I disagree. Mostly, I'm sure you can see why I disagree, but mostly on the basis that I think that over time, I think there will be more nuance both in the religious sphere and the religious conversation, and in this particular dichotomy, like I say dichotomy, but I think there's going to be more nuance that develops there, and I think that's kind of where you're coming from with that, which is there's going to be so much nuance that believing anything other than that is going to be considered fringe. But I think that there's also going to be more nuanced conversation within the realm of science. I don't think in 100 years that the theory of evolution will look the same at all. You could say it will evolve in the next 100 years, but but I think that I think there's a lot of elements in which there is more nuance coming into that conversation from a scientific perspective because of this opening up of more conversations as to the legitimacy of this and why was it brought about and how much of the science supporting it was developed, because it was following good science and how much of it was developed because it was following a narrative. And the more that that's picked apart, the more data that comes out, the more I think that conversation will change. And so I don't think that it's ever really going to converge quite that hard. I do think that there's going to be an element in which the church accepts more of those opinions, but I don't think there's going to be one set that's going to be like, that you must believe this, or you're going to be considered an outcast.
I don't know. I think I'll take Brad's side on this one just for fun, because I agree with Jordan in the sense that it's gonna become more nuanced. People are gonna be open to more nuanced positions, but then you have to realize people suck, and people don't like nuance. It's gonna be so much easier if somebody says, "All right, this is what we believe, and this is what you gotta believe," and that. If it right now, maybe that's a literal 7-day creation, maybe some denominations are going to take that into theistic evolution and start making that creedal, even if they don't have it like literally written in a creed. I don't know the last time I've seen a denomination actually write up a new creed, but they will make statements of faith. They will come up with like a massive, like, I don't know, maybe at the Southern Baptist Convention, that would be something that they adopt. I don't know if that would be considered a creed. But I'm sure that there will be statements that are made where it's like, this is what this denomination believes. And yeah, Jordan, you're absolutely right in the sense that evolution is the theory of evolution and the field of evolutionary biology is continuing to grow and change. Like now kind of one of the growing models is extended evolutionary synthesis, where we're trying to take into account not just genetic changes and mutations, but also changes at the RNA level of regulation and protein level of regulation, and histone modifications and chromatin modifications and epigenetics and transcriptomics and epitranscriptomics. And there's all these other things we're synthesizing. And the reason you just put your hand over your head like it's going way over there is because that's not something in the scientific field we're going to talk about just in general public society, because it's nuanced and it's specialized information. And I don't think that type of information is going to be seeping into the churches anytime soon. Instead, I think it's just going to be, okay, well, what's the popular rendition of this theory? Okay, cool, we'll accept that. And it'll just be put into black and white terms when it shouldn't be. So I can absolutely see this happening. And I'm not going to call it a good thing by any means. But people like creedal statements because it means they don't have to think about it for themselves. So I bet it'll happen.
Just to respond to those two perspectives, one of which was correct and one was incorrect.
Sorry, my bad.
So first off, Jace mentioned that there haven't been creeds recently. Well, the 1908 Social Creed by the PCUSA was relatively recent in the grand scheme of things. It was updated in 2008 by the Social Creed for the 21st Century, also PCUSA. We have a new creed in 1968 by the United Church of Canada, and we have the Australian Creed for Sexual Integrity, which isn't dated on here, but I think it's somewhat recent. In any case, my broader point is we've seen a move towards a desire, like Jace has said, to have more built-in guidelines to religion, more guardrails as we've become, in some ways, more conservative in recent years. We see this with the rise of Gen Z becoming more conservative than its previous generations. And I think part of that comes with a desire for creedalism, but I also think that because of the evolution-steeped climate in which Gen Z and my generation, the millennials, have been raised, they're going to take that millennial or Gen Z perspective of mostly supporting evolution and are going to put it into a religious rule set because that's what people do. And I also think that we've seen the splintering between more conservative and more theological liberal perspectives in the mainline Protestant denominations. And so where we haven't seen that, the more evangelical or theologically conservative denominations, I think we're going to see the same thing begin to happen among Baptists, again, Church of Christ, Pentecostal, non-denominational, so on and so forth. Lastly, I'm not going to pretend this is a good thing, and I am going to add that part of the section is taking a stronger stance than we might have otherwise. But, yeah, that's my hot take.
Right. I think that about wraps up our conversation on the Scopes trial. It's been 100 years since it happened. I am glad it's been 100 years since it happened, and I hope we don't repeat one in this century, because I think regardless of your stance on who did what right and wrong, it was not a good look on religion, and it was just kind of damaging all around, for society, for who we are as a nation, for how we see ourselves, how we view religion. And
I
so,
don't think it was a good look for atheism, and I don't think most modern atheists think it was a good look for atheism either.
yeah, I mean, fully agree. And so I think we've learned a lot of lessons over the last 100 years. And I think when we look back at the Scopes trial now, we shouldn't just be looking back at it as some media spectacle that's fun to watch and let's go enjoy a play about Inherit the Wind. But I think that there are some real lessons that we should be taking from it, especially in what not to do, how not to handle these debates, how not to make a spectacle of, honestly, very serious religious matters. Because when you're dealing with religion, there's a certain level of respect and decorum that I think we need to keep with it, because we're talking about God, we're talking about things that matter. And so when we break it down into a monkey circus show, we're doing a massive disservice to both those who agree with us, those who disagree with us, but even to God himself. And so I think that's a type of respect that we need to keep in mind as we move forward, and hopefully we'll continue to heal that divide between religion and science and get God back in the public sphere and start framing our scientific views and theories and frameworks more in line with what reality as a whole and the truth of reality as a whole is, not just the truth of the physical universe, because there's so much more to it than that. And if the physical universe is all there was, then, I mean, life just feels kind of meaningless, you know?
It doesn't make much sense in that regard, and I think that that's becoming very apparent. I think that as time goes on, the conversation in society is shifting from, I guess, a moral desire to be free from morality, to understanding that a world without a spiritual element not only is unfulfilling but is nonsensical. Just the world that we live in, and again, it goes back to this element of, in my opinion, unscientific, to devoid the world and the universe of a creator. If we're really going to truly see the universe for what it is, we have to accept the one who created it, and we have to accept the truth that he created it, and what that means for us, and how it affects the way we view the world. If we don't, then we're basically closing our eyes and putting our heads in the sand. And to your point, I think that if we can start having these conversations, even if we don't come to the same conclusions, and there's no chance that we ever will, I think at least we can try to undo the damage that's been done of keeping these things separate and completely unassociated.
All right. Well, I don't have anything to add to that except that if you haven't already, please go ahead and evolve that subscribe button by hitting it and changing it from its current state to a better state. Thanks very much for watching, guys. God bless and have a great day.
Bye.